Chapter 7 is about motivation concept. There's a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to move very rapidly through this chapter. Motivation is the process that accounts for an individual's intensity, direction, and persistence toward achieving a goal. So those are the elements that create motivation. How motivated is someone? How much do they want it? How long will they stay at it? Those are the questions that we'll ask. Now, one of the most popular concepts in motivation is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and you've probably seen this in college, in a Psych 101 class. You may have seen it in high school or somewhere else as well. So if the individual satisfies their physiological needs, then they look at their safety needs, then they look at social and esteem, and eventually they get all the way to self-actualization. And it sounds great, but unfortunately, the research doesn't validate Maslow's hierarchy. And, U.S. Marines and missionaries invert that all the time, where they put other needs higher than their own safety. So there's something to it. It has an interesting feel, but I wouldn't pin everything on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Now, we also have a very important concept in the academic literature, that's theory X and theory Y. Now, theory X assumptions are basically negative. So McGregor was actually saying one theory says that, again, this is theory X, that workers are lazy and stupid and they're trying to not do work. Theory Y, on the other hand, says work is as natural as play and they want to do the work. And it's interesting because I'm not sure that either one is complete in and of itself, although I would lean more toward theory Y is accurate than theory X, just because theory X is missing some pieces. Now, what's interesting to my mind is that X is incomplete, Y doesn't go far enough, and I want to propose something else. And this is a little bit more theological. So from a Christian perspective, we want to look at it like this. Man is made in the image of God. He's designed to do great things. Like his creator, he is creative. There's a certain theory why-ness to him, but he's also fallen into sin. He's, in Calvin's words, completely depraved, right? And you don't have to use that particular language, but that means that he's infected in all his parts. So he's not good and perfect and on the side of the angels. And if you watch the news, you find that that is true, right? I mean, nobody's really arguing that we are inherently good and we do good things all the time. So it's neither theory X nor theory Y, but parts of both seem to work. Those two things, that made in the image of God and still infected by sin, are in tandem. I mean, those things happen simultaneously. So, and it's not just the workers that you need to watch out for, it's also management. In fact, the higher you go, the more likely you're going to get into that triangle with the narcissism and the psychopathology, right? So it's not really theory X. I would put that aside. It's not really theory Y because it's incomplete, although it's a little bit more accurate. That is, that people naturally or innately want to do that. But your biblical worldview should inform you that it's kind of both. So you do have to watch workers to make sure that they're not stealing, and you have controls, but you don't need to clamp down on them and make them do stuff because they're lazy. On the same side, I would be more concerned with watching management. The higher they get, the more likely, statistically, and this is proven in the academic literature, the more likely they are to think that they're above or beyond the system and they don't have to be regulated. And that's when you see CEOs and vice presidents and things get into trouble because they start to think that they're above the system. So it's a little bit of both. It's neither theory X nor theory Y. Theory Y is a little closer, but I would inform it with a scriptural understanding of the nature of man. So let's look at Herzberg. So Herzberg came along, and you see here the comparison between satisfiers and dissatisfiers. And satisfiers are things like achievement and recognition and the work itself. And that seems to sound very theory Y, right? And dissatisfiers, look at the big one. The big one here is policies that get in the way, policies, and then supervision. Those are the two big ones. Everything else is a lot smaller in the way. But that also seems to sound like theory Y because they don't want things getting in the way. They want to do their work. We used to think that satisfaction was measured on one scale. It was going from satisfaction to dissatisfaction. But Herzberg came along and said, no, there are motivators, and then there's a whole group of of hygiene factors, and you have to look at both continuums in order to get it. Now, I like Herzberg's theory. There are criticism of Herzberg's theory because of the methodology, and there's some argument that it works, and then there's, I think, a little bit stronger argument that we're not sure, we don't know, and I think that's probably true, but intuitively I like it because, yeah, I mean, those kind of things, if you look at satisfiers and you look at hygiene factors, it makes a lot of sense. So you can take that and do with it as you will. McClelland's theory of needs. So you have a high need for achievement, or a high need for power, or a high need for affiliation. So think about a salesman in an organization. If he has a high need for achievement, he's going to go and make sales and make sales and make sales and make sales, right? He's going to be the record setter that's going to get the trip to Aruba. Now, what we do very often in most organizations is we take that high achiever and we put him as the manager, and then he flounders because the kind of person that's going to be a good manager maybe has a greater need for power and a little affiliation than he does for achievement himself. And just like a coach and an awesome coach wasn't necessarily the best basketball player, same thing, the best salesman doesn't always make the best manager. And so you have to be aware of how those individual needs will affect individuals. Okay, so we have, again, the need for achievement is a drive to excel in relation to a particular standard. Think that salesman. Then you have the need for power, and that's the need to kind of be in charge of things. And then you have the need for affiliation to develop close friendships with others. And those are three very different needs. Now, McClelland's theory has a lot of support in the literature. I think that you can really hang your hat on this one. Self-determination theory proposes that we want to feel control over our actions. I mean, this isn't anything groundbreaking or new, but you'd be amazed at how many managers just want to tell people what to do rather than allow people to kind of create their own, or carve out their own destiny within certain constraints. Self-determination theory also proposes another interesting aspect, and that is that when you're paid for something, now you feel like you have to do it instead of that you want to do it. Now, this won't work in corporate America, saying, well, if that's the case, we just won't pay you because, I have to eat, you have to eat. It's not going to work like that, but be careful when you're, say, asking a friend to help you with something as opposed to paying them $50. If I ask a friend to come help me move, I'm working in a whole different spectrum than of our relationship than if I say, hey, come over on Saturday, I'll give you $50 to help me move. You've just changed it, and now one is kind of drudgery, but you're going to get that external reward, and the other is, hey, I'm there for him, he's there for me, and that's a different relationship. Goal setting theory, specific goals. Here's what we know about goal setting theory. Specific goals increase performance. Okay, if you don't know what you're shooting at, you're not going to shoot it. Difficult goals, if they're accepted, if you work participatively with the management and the employee, and you accept those goals, those will result in higher performance. Not just goals that are handed down to you, but goals that you really accept. And when I say really accept, I don't mean you have to accept because otherwise management's going to be upset with you. But I mean, it's really something that you embrace. And then feedback also leads to higher performance. So how are you doing? How can I help you? What can we do to tweak this? Those are three things that will lead to higher performance, and it's clear in the empirical literature in goal-setting theory. Self-efficacy theory. This is very simple as well. Essentially, if you believe that you have the ability or the capacity to do something, if you know you're capable of the task, you're going to go pursue it. This is also in some literature talked about as social cognitive theory, or social learning theory. But it's all essentially the same thing. Now, we get to reinforcement theory, and now we got something a little different. This was B.F. Skinner's behaviorism, and the idea is that reinforcement will condition behavior. It'll cause you to do something over time. In Skinner's radical understanding of this, you had no free will, but you do have free will. I mean, you can choose to turn me off at any time right now. You have that free will. I'm not making you watch. So you have that choice. There's some place between stimulus and response, and that is your free will. So it kind of works a little bit, but not like Skinner would have thought. Then we have social learning theory, and I have a picture here of a cast of a leg in a broken cast. And I want to just tell you a story. So the way that I understand this, let me first define it. We can learn both through observation and direct experience. And I think, I've always thought that trial and error was the hardest way to learn. Observation, watching how it happens to somebody else, and then doing or not doing that thing is probably a simpler, less painful way. So my best friend in high school growing up, he thought it would be a great idea to jump from a bridge to try to catch a tree limb and swing on it, and he missed a tree. So he had a cast. And I embrace social learning theory. I do not. I did not jump. That's not something that I thought was a good idea. That's social learning theory. Okay? Equity theory. Equity theory says that when employees perceive an inequity, then they will alter the parameters in order to make it equitable again. So they'll either change their inputs or their outcomes or their perception or the referent. So if I look at my pay, right, and I compare myself against somebody else, that's my referent, and I'm looking at is it the same for the same kind of job, or am I making less? Is he making more, or vice versa? And so what happens is, and you'll see in this equity theory, that if you're underpaid relative to your referent, you're angry. I mean, that makes sense, right? And if you're overpaid, you actually work harder to try to get to equal that out. So if you're overpaid relative to what you know your job is worth, you work harder to try to make that fair. And so equity theory is a really interesting thing. So there is a case to be made for paying your employees really well as a consequence of that. We also talk about justice. There's distributive justice, procedural justice, and interactional justice. Distributive justice is the kind of thing where you're looking at the fairness of the outcome. And in procedural justice was the procedure to get to that outcome fair. And then interactional is where you listen to, respect, those kind of things. Now you have to have all three pieces. If you don't have all three pieces, you don't really have organizational justice, and there's going to be a problem. People are funny. And, in the other lecture, we were talking about how we're kind of irrational. We kind of are. I mean, if you're slighted, you still remember that slight. I mean, even if you got the right outcome. And so you have to work through all three of those pieces. So the implications for all of this, everything that we've been talking about are this. Individuals should choose their job for reasons other than extrinsic rewards. So don't just go to the highest paying job. Go to one where you're going to be satisfied, where you're going to be able to contribute and do something meaningful. And an organization should also think in terms of intrinsic as well as extrinsic activities. It's not saying cut pay or anything along those lines. And we'll talk in the next lecture about messing with my rice bowl. You don't want to mess with somebody's salary. That's very dangerous. But offer beyond the intrinsic or the extrinsic rewards, intrinsic satisfactions. And then also clear and difficult goals are going to lead to higher levels of employee productivity. And we would think it might be the opposite, but really if they have something to shoot for and it's something that they chose, not something that you put upon them, but something that they are interested in achieving, they'll work harder to achieve it more often than not. And then equity theory helps us understand productivity, satisfaction, absence, turnover, all those things are tied to equity theory. And then finally, there are many ways that you can inadvertently demotivate your people. Read this chapter very, very carefully because there are a ton of ways that you can really put people off and not even know that you're doing it just by slighting or by not listening or whatever else, or telling them to do something rather than asking them how it could be done. So I want to wrap up with this. Your theory of human nature is going to matter a great deal. If you think that people are just lab rats like B.F. Skinner, you're going to treat them one way. If you think that people are theory X, you're going to treat them a different way. If you think that people are theory Y, a different way still. And if you have a really strong grounding in Christian theology and you start thinking through, hey, wait a minute, this person's made in the image of God. In the same way that I'm made in the image of God and I'm creative and I want to do excellent work, and I want to have a purpose and meaning, so does that other person that I'm managing. And when you think in those terms, you act differently. So I urge you to think through those things as we read through the chapter. Thank you for your time, and I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.